welcome to Buddhism in a Nutshell, class four of five. So we'll be finishing up next week. Were there any questions on prior material before we move on to new material?
Not from us, Venerable.
Right. Okay, so get started. So we ended the last portion of last week's class talking about karma, and that's where we're going to pick things up and finish that discussion on karma. We talked about the factors that are necessary for complete karma, how if any of those factors are absent, then you have a karma, but you have an incomplete karma. And an incomplete karma is called a completing karma, and a complete karma is called a throwing karma, because complete karmas are able to ripen at the time of death and establish the kind of rebirth that a sentient being is going to then experience. And then in a given lifetime, you've got karmas that are ripening, still ripening. It isn't as though karma only ripens at the time of death. Karma is being created all of the time, and karma is ripening all of the time. But within a particular lifetime, it's filling out the experiences of that lifetime, rather than establishing a lifetime. So these are the four, what they call the four general characteristics of karma, the four outlines of karma. So, and this applies to whether the karma is constructive or destructive, another way of phrasing that is positive or negative. So again, a positive or constructive karma is a karma that is motivated by the wish to benefit. A destructive karma, a negative karma, is any action of body, speech, or mind where the motivation is the wish to cause harm. So any kind of karma, whether it's positive or negative, we can first say that karma, so here we're talking about the correlation between the laying down of that karmic seed in the mind when the action is engaged in, and then subsequently the ripening of that karmic potential that is laid in the mind through the action of body, speech, or mind. So that process of creating and then the ripening of karma is said to be characterized by these four statements. The first of which is that karma is definite, meaning that at the moment that a karmic seed is laid in the mind, it remains in the mind, and it is definite to be experienced at some point in the future, unless there is an interfering force. And we talked a little bit about the idea of interfering forces. For a negative karma, the good news is that there is such a thing as the purification of negative karma, which is that interfering force that can interrupt that continuity of that karmic seed in the mind. If there is no purification, then at some point that karma will meet with the necessary causes and conditions, and it will ripen as experience either during a lifetime or in the intermediate state, if that's when the causes and conditions come together. But regardless, karma is definite to be experienced in the absence of an interfering force. with regard to a constructive karma, there is still the possibility of interfering with that continuity as well, which we don't want. We would want that with respect to a mistake that we've made where we, under the influence of affliction, we engaged in a destructive action. The good news with regard to those actions is we still have the capacity to interrupt that continuity. However, the psychological processes that underlie that are also potentially, available to us with regard to a positive karma, which a positive karma, we don't want to interrupt that continuity. Um, for example, we talked when we talked a little bit about this idea of purifying negative karma, we discussed how regret is important. Seeing how, understanding that what one has done has caused harm, is not in keeping with one's spiritual aspirations, is harmful to oneself and others. Really recognizing that, um, and generating a strong sense of regret can reduce that karmic seed, that karmic potential. However, we may engage in a constructive action and then also subsequently come to regret it. We might, um, do something with, a genuine wish to be helpful to someone, and then that person might not appreciate what we've done. They might, blow us off. They might not react in the way that we were hoping. And then we might think, well, they were ungrateful. I never should have benefited them. They didn't do what I wanted. They didn't act how I was hoping. Um, and that moment of regret is going to weaken that positive karma in the same way that it would if it were a negative karma. And that isn't what we would want to have happen. Because a positive karma, moving on to the next point, positive and negative, or constructive and destructive karmic seeds that are laid in the mind, they will ripen in a way that is similar to you could say, the energy that was present in the mind at the time that the karmic seed was laid down. So a negative karmic seed was motivated by the wish to harm, and a positive karmic seed was motivated by the wish to benefit. And those are different energies, right? The energy that's associated with the wish to cause harm is a, kind of a painful, constricted, um, negative state of mind. And therefore, when that energy ripens as experience, the experience will be painful. The experience will be suffering. The experience will be difficult, unpleasant. Whereas when a positive karma is engaged in, that mind is, an open mind. It's a compassionate mind, a loving mind, a patient mind, a generous mind. And that has a tone to it as well. And so that karmic seed, when it ripens as experience, it will bring about a beneficial, constructive, supportive, useful result. And that is what we want, right? We ourselves don't want to suffer. We want to be happy. And so we want to nurture constructive karmic seeds, and we want to avoid negative karmic seeds. So it's important then, to understand that this idea of opposing force. We want to pursue opposing force if we engaged in a mistaken action. We want to avoid opposing forces if we have engaged in a positive action. So that means kind of being, in terms of positive actions, could mean, trying to be realistic about what our potential is, not pushing too hard, and then coming to regret what we've done. So then the third outline is that all karma is individual, which means necessarily we can judge in our own experience if positive experiences are arising, then we can judge that in the past, that is the ripening of a constructive karmic seed that was laid down in the mind stream of this mind that is associated with this body. We know that based on what we've said in previous classes, that what mind does is associates with form, and that association has lifetimes and then deaths and then separation of body and mind and then a repeating of that process. Um, so the mind is this beginningless and endless continuity, and forms are, temporary. Forms are coming into being and then coming out of, going into existence, coming out of existence, at least in terms of a functioning form. Maybe the constituent quarks and so on are eternal, but the functioning form, is temporary. So we can't then ever experience a result that wasn't created by this continuity of mind. The karmic seeds that we are laying down in this lifetime will ripen probably in a different lifetime, and the karmic seeds that are ripening in this lifetime were laid down in a previous lifetime, but it's all part of the same continuity of mind. So you create a karmic seed. I can't experience that result. I create a karmic seed. You can't experience that result because you and I have necessarily different mental continuities. And then the fourth outline of karma is that all karma, positive or negative, there is an expansion that happens in terms of the type of result that comes about from the seed, meaning that a small positive action over time will grow and will bring about a larger positive result than the initial karmic seed that you started out with. And the reverse is also true. A smaller negative action over time is going to bring a result that would seem larger than the negative action that was engaged in. So again, what that implies, if we want to work cooperatively with these outlines of karma, then that does mean that we should be vigilant about all negative karmas, and we should take opportunities or find opportunities to engage in even small positive actions. We shouldn't allow opportunities to pass us by to engage in even small positive actions because they are going to bring a result that seems, that would seem larger than that initial action that didn't really cost us anything, wasn't really difficult for us to engage in. Okay, so those are the four outlines of karma. Are there any questions, thoughts, or questions about the four characteristics or the four outlines of karma? Nope. Okay. Okay, so now we have finished in the foundation of all good qualities, Lama Tsongkhapa's text that we're using. We finished that small scope that we talked about, We talked about how the lamrim is organized into three scopes: the small, the middling, and the great scope. We've covered all of the topics that you would find in the small scope. So, we're talking here about impermanence and death, precious human rebirth, karma, how to properly relate to the spiritual guide, and so on. This is um, the technology that we need to, and going along with the idea of the precious human. I'm sorry, the idea of the properly relating to the spiritual guide, also then understanding refuge and, refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. Um, so that's really the technology that we need to accomplish the goal of the initial scope, the small scope, and that practitioner is motivated to avoid the worst kinds of suffering that exist in cyclic existence, to close the door to the lower realms. So that has a lot to do with karma, ultimately. So avoiding negative karma, because that process of taking rebirth in the lower realms is a karmically driven process. So if we deeply understand karma, then we can purify our negative karma, we can engage in constructive karma, and ultimately we can close the door to the lower realms. And then only be able to experience at least good future rebirths. However, now we're going to move into the middle scope. And on the middle scope, we need to recognize that we have to go beyond just creating the causes for good future rebirths and closing the door to the lower realms, because even good future rebirths are not the the best. They still have suffering. We know, as we said before, the life that we have is a good future rebirth, is a good upper realm rebirth, and yet there's lots of suffering that we are subject to. So this next verse from Lama Tsongkhapa is um, helping us to recognize that the pleasures of cyclic existence, meaning, the kinds of relatively better experiences that are open to us in these upper realm rebirths, they are not a stable happiness. We talked about the the suffering of suffering, the suffering of change, all pervasive suffering. Those are really the only kinds of experiences that ordinary cyclic ordinary sentient beings who are cycling within samsara are able to have available to them. And so here, when we really analyze what is it that is open to me in these upper realm rebirths, we can see the shortcomings of those kinds of experiences. And then we start to turn away from wanting to create the causes and the conditions of good future rebirths, at least from the perspective of seeing them as a good in and of itself, seeing it as something that, just saying, well, uh, you know, taking rebirth in the hell realm, the spirit realm, the hungry ghost realm, the animal realm, that's bad. But, taking rebirth as a human, taking rebirth in the upper realms, the formless realm, the form realm, the celestial realms, that's somehow intrinsically good. We really contemplate, well, what happens in those realms? And again, in the longer lamrim texts, the lamrim chenmo, the middle length lamrim, Yangtze Rinpoche is practicing the path, they're going to give you chapters of material where they describe what is available to the beings experiencing these upper realm rebirths, and how all of that comparatively better experience is still not truly satisfying, unstable, unreliable. And what we want to do now is orient ourselves away from just getting more and more and more of that toward orienting ourselves toward, at least, liberation, putting an end to cyclic existence, as a, putting an end to it completely. So then the next verse is just going along with that. So, led by this pure thought, the pure thought of turning away and orienting ourselves toward, liberation rather than an endless cycle of just rebirth within samsara. Then here, what this is saying, again, we've talked about the vows of individual liberation, the vows, and there's different sets of vows. There's the refuge vows, the lay vows, the vows of a monk or a nun, the bodhisattva vows. There's lots of different vows, and these are all going to help us to see how we turn away from creating these causes and these conditions, particularly when we join, the bodhisattva vows, the tantric vows. We engage in all of these different sets of vows in a progressive manner. And when we do that, we start to orient ourselves away from just thinking of samsara as a good in and of itself. We might see some utility in it, recognizing that we need to give ourselves enough time to complete our training, and that may require more than one lifetime. But with restraint, when we restrain ourselves through vows, we don't get as caught up in all of the sensory experiences that are open to us. We have more time, more space to develop the mind, to go inward, to withdraw to some degree from getting so wrapped up in just having more and more of these unstable, unreliable sensory experiences. So that's what pratimoksha. Pratimoksha means individual liberation vows. So we really see the pitfalls of getting so wrapped up in sensory experiences, and we begin to cultivate our inner spiritual lives through the different ways of restraining our sense doors, the body, the speech, the mind, with all of these different sets of vows that the Buddha gave. Okay, any thoughts or questions? Okay, so really, I mean, with just those two, now, I mean, of course, when a person is practicing the middle scope, as I mentioned, they have to contemplate again and again all of the disadvantages, all of the shortcomings of cyclic existence. And that is a very detailed, lengthy process where they think about, there's different lists, the 6 sufferings, the 8 sufferings, all of these different shortcomings that characterize even the best kinds of lifetimes that are available to us as an ordinary sentient being. But that's really what you do. And then you kind of, the only alternative to that is liberation, is individual, liberation at least. So then you would practice that. You would, move in that direction. So just with those verses, we've covered all of the middle scope. There's not really a lot of different, because again, this is just a very broad overview. We're not going to go into all of the actual contemplations of what happens. but that's the gist of it. That's essentially what you do. Um, so there is now the great scope. We've gone all the way in half an hour. We've finished the small scope and we've covered the middle scope, and now we're going to begin talking about the great scope. So a Theravadan practitioner would stop, on the small scope. A Theravadan practitioner would um, generate this extreme wariness of cyclic existence, and then they would just devote themselves to individual liberation. However, there is on the Mahayana path, there is the great scope. So it is possible to go further, to yes, develop that weariness with cyclic existence, to give up kind of, you do have to, this is what's called renunciation. Renunciation is kind of, we talked about the three principal aspects of the path when we talked about the threefold path in the very, I think the second class or third class. So renunciation is the result of really, I mean, really renunciation to some degree begins on the small scope, where if you have no renunciation, the word renunciation means to turn away from suffering, to give up creating the causes of suffering. So a practitioner kind of begins that process on the small scope, where could be a person who has no concept of renunciation. They might steal, right? They might lie, they might manipulate, they might do unethical things because they're just like, well, the candy bar is in front of me, I want it, so I'll just take it, right? They don't really see the long-term consequences of the suffering that they are creating. They don't really care about the suffering that they're creating for others. They don't care about their own long-term suffering that's karmically driven. They're just kind of in the moment, and they just want, they're totally under the afflictions, and so they just kind of, they might rob a bank, they might do all kinds of unethical things just to get what they want in the moment. And a small scope practitioner is someone who is learning more and more about karma, the law of cause and effect. And so they are renouncing the worst kinds of karmic actions. They are renouncing killing, they are renouncing stealing and lying and so on, because those are the actions that generate the worst kinds of suffering. But renunciation can be deepened, and it is deepened on the middle scope, where even the subtle sufferings that are occurring in the upper realms, the karmic causes of those are also being renounced, also being, turning away from creating the karmic causes of even subtle suffering. However, if a person's really practicing the Mahayana path, they are going to want to also practice the great scope, where they see even the disadvantages of individual liberation, which are being introduced here in this verse. Just as I have fallen into the sea of samsara, so have all mother migratory beings. Please bless me to see this, train in supreme bodhicitta, and bear the responsibility of freeing migratory beings. So we've said with individual liberation, which is a path, a valid path taught by the Buddha, but when a practitioner accomplishes that, if a practitioner accomplishes that, they themselves have accomplished their own highest welfare, and yet they abide after their death, they abide separate from cyclic existence completely forever, and therefore are unable to benefit sentient beings. A practitioner of the small scope is seeing how that is disadvantageous, because sentient beings, all other sentient beings, are still subject to suffering. So this practitioner is moved by the suffering of others, not really so much one's own suffering, because that can be fully eliminated through individual liberation. But really, they're moved primarily by understanding the suffering of others, having contemplated on the middle scope. It's not different, right? You've already done that work. You've already understood the overt, intense, overt sufferings of the lower realms, and you've understood the subtler but very real sufferings of even the upper realms. And here you're recognizing, well, okay, that's my existential condition as an ordinary sentient being, to be subject to all of those sufferings, but also it's the existential condition of all other sentient beings. And if I just achieve individual liberation, I'm doing nothing to work for the benefit of all of those other suffering sentient beings. And that's what a great scope practitioner is now cultivating. They're now cultivating a mind that has that motivation, not the motivation of looking out for my own suffering, but a motivation of looking out for the suffering of others. Yeah. So we're now going to talk for a while principally about this idea of bodhicitta that is introduced here. Bodhicitta, the word Bodhi means awakening, and chitta means mind. So it translates into English as the mind of awakening, which doesn't tell you very much about what it means. The definition of the word bodhicitta is the aspiration to achieve not individual liberation, but full enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings, without exception, every sentient being. As it says here, bear the responsibility of freeing migratory beings, freeing them from being an ordinary sentient being cycling within samsara. So to take responsibility for bringing all sentient beings to the state of full enlightenment, and recognizing that oneself must achieve enlightenment in order to be capable of that. So there are principally two meditative traditions that are used to cultivate this state of mind, this aspiration. And that's what we'll talk about. Um, okay, any thoughts or questions? Yes.
Well, Venerable, I was just wondering, what's the fundamental, or what are the fundamental differences between self-liberation and ultimate liberation? I guess I'm wondering if after self-liberation, then you're just liberated, so there's no need to come back to samsara. Or is it that at some point in time, after self-liberation, you still need to be back here on some level to go through the Mahayana path to get to ultimate enlightenment, ultimate liberation or enlightenment?
So you don't, you don't need to. There are teachings that suggest that fully enlightened beings, Buddhas, fully enlightened beings, two synonymous words, phrases that mean the same thing, those who have gone through the Mahayana path, who have achieved full enlightenment, who are Buddhas, they can reach the beings who are experiencing individual liberation, who are experiencing lower nirvana, individual enlightenment. And they can attempt to exhort or encourage those, you could say, nirvanic beings, because again, individual, lower nirvana, in whatever phrasing you want to use, those enlightened beings can exhort the beings experiencing individual enlightenment to go further in, to engage in further practice. But it isn't, it isn't necessary. I don't know like what the success rate of that process. Maybe it's 100%. I have no idea. Um, it is, they describe the state of individual enlightenment as being, just the most blissful, the most peaceful, the most contented state. So there, for that mind in experiencing individual enlightenment, I don't think that, subjectively speaking, there's anything in it for them going further. I don't believe that it gets better for them. The teachings, as I understand it, suggest that individual enlightenment is one's own highest welfare. But it does, so the difference is that a being, what is different about those two states is not, as far as I understand it, not the subjective experience of those two types of beings, but whether or not those beings are able to choose to reincarnate their minds into the places where there are ordinary sentient beings with the goal of benefiting those sentient beings. A being experiencing individual liberation for as long as they continue to experience it are not capable, because we've talked about what are called the subtle obscurations to knowledge that persist in their mind. Those subtle obscurations to knowledge don't get in the way of individual enlightenment, but they do get in the way of full enlightenment. So that sentient being simply can't, or it's no longer a sentient being, but it's not Sem Chen, it's not a Mai, but it's a nirvanic being or a being experiencing individual liberation. It's great, like it's having a ball, but it is fully separated from all of the places where ordinary sentient beings are abiding. And so really, it is the presence of unbearable love and compassion in the mind stream of the practitioner that diverts them from that path, that where they would see, well, yeah, there's everything that I need, I can find in individual enlightenment, but I'm leaving out all other sentient beings, and I don't want to do that. I want to do this other path that the Buddha also taught, wherein not only is my own highest welfare achieved, but I've removed the subtle obscurations to knowledge, and now I'm capable of using my enlightenment to intentionally take my, put my mind back into these places where there are ordinary sentient beings. And because I'm enlightened, because I'm omniscient, because I can see the karma of all of these ordinary sentient beings, I know perfectly how to help them, how to guide them, how to shape their choices, how to give them, of course, it's still up to those sentient beings. Just like it's that we're sentient beings, we can ignore advice that we're given. We can, choose to not make different choices. That's every, sentient beings have free will in that sense. But that's the only difference, as I understand it, between what is happening for those two sentient beings. And it's just that due to this kind of training that's in the great scope, a person becomes motivated, becomes interested. They lose interest in pursuing the path of individual enlightenment, and they become interested in pursuing the path of full enlightenment out of great love and compassion.
Okay, thank you.
Any other thoughts or questions? Okay, so if you're going to develop uh, this aspiration, as I said, this wish, this desire to achieve full enlightenment, so that you have the ability to lead all other sentient beings to their enlightenment. First, what you have to do, there is a meditation on the Great Scope called equanimity, and it's a precursor to, or a prerequisite or a precursor to develop, to being able to develop bodhicitta, this wish to achieve full enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. Because the practitioner, this is, of course, we've flown through the small scope and the middle scope, but this is a practitioner who has mastered the small scope and the middle scope. But what they've not, but there's no technology in the small scope or the middle scope where the practitioner has yet developed equal regard for all sentient beings. A practitioner can master the small scope, can master the middle scope, and still, when they're relating to other sentient beings, they are going to do that in a biased way. They are going to prefer those sentient beings that are benefiting them. They are going to be kind of neutral to sentient beings who they're not really interacting with at all. And they're going to be hostile toward sentient beings that are harming them, who they feel like are acting against their own interests or the interests of their loved ones, right? There's nothing in the Buddhist path up until this point that has dealt with this bias that exists in the minds of all ordinary persons. So now in the Great Scope, there is this meditation where we can overcome that bias. And we have to do that, right? Because if we don't overcome that bias, we will never genuinely wish for the enlightenment of people who are harming us. Um, and we really probably wouldn't even develop it toward those who are total strangers to us. We would develop it to our loved ones, our friends, our family, people that we really like. We'd be like, yeah, I can see, I really like you, so I want you to have all of this amazing, all of these benefits of enlightenment. But if someone, has harmed us in a strong way, we would be like, I want you to suffer. I want terrible things to happen to you. And that bias has to be overcome in order for bodhicitta to take root. So basically, in this meditation, you try to see through that very surface level way of thinking, right? You try to see all sentient beings simply as suffering sentient beings, not, I mean, recognizing, of course, that yes, in this one lifetime, some sentient beings are more aligned with my interests than others, but I've had beginningless past lives, and all other sentient beings have had beginningless past lives. So really, what's true is that every sentient being is just a suffering sentient being, and it's whether in a particular moment, you know, my willingness to benefit them should in no way be informed by whether, in this one particular moment in time, I feel like their interests are aligned with my interests, because we have been, you know, we've had all kinds of relationships over beginningless past lives, and that's the deeper truth. So you contemplate, how inconsequential, how insubstantial being driven by, our ego is in relationship to our willingness to benefit sentient beings. And of course, I mean, that's a incredibly profound realization to come to. And it's, of course, no one's saying it's easy. But you work with that. You work with that bias over and over and over again. And ultimately, the hope is that you can see the logic of relating to all sentient beings simply through the lens of this is a suffering sentient being that I ought to benefit. And once you've cleared away that bias, now it really does become possible that you could develop bodhicitta. You could, um, become become a bodhisattva. You've all heard the term bodhisattva, which means person. Sattva means person. So bodhisattva is a person who has bodhicitta. Uh, and yeah, so once you've done this, once you've developed an equanimous mind, a mind that has equal regard for all sentient beings, then you can become a bodhisattva. Okay. Are there any questions about that or? Yes.
I I hope you can edit this part out of the recording. So my question is, or my thinking, I mean, I've gotten over it, but now it's if every single sentient being has people who are attached to them and people care about them and people love them. So even the people who've harmed me that I have an aversion towards, they have people who totally love them, right? So wouldn't it be more advantageous or more effective if cost effective in terms of time, if I focus on liberating the people who I like, and then you can focus on liberating the people who you like, even though they've harmed me and I'm not focused on them, instead of me trying to get to the point where I'm liberating everybody, if that makes sense. Then everybody gets liberated by the people who want to liberate them. And then if anybody's left over, then the people who've cultivated bodhicitta, then they can do the sweeping and pick up everybody else who's left.
Well, I think the shortest answer is that without bodhicitta, you actually can't achieve full enlightenment.
Okay.
It is actually a necessary precondition to it's not, there is no method. The Buddha doesn't have a method wherein it's an option for you. You can achieve individual liberation without this. That's a doorway that's open to you. But there is no process wherein full enlightenment is open to you without equanimity and therefore bodhicitta, and bodhicitta isn't liberating a small group of sentient beings, right? Bodhicitta is not leaving, not even leaving like the worst criminal, like the serial killers, the people who've done just the most awful, the most heinous things that you can imagine. They didn't even do anything to you necessarily, but we can't even leave them out, right? Of genuine bodhicitta. Without developing that kind of mind, full enlightenment is blocked. Full enlightenment will never arise for us. So there's that. I guess that maybe that's the most comprehensive answer, is that we have to decide, what, if I aspire to enlightenment, then I have no choice. I can't, there is no pathway in the Buddha's teachings that allows me to get that particular result unless I also cultivate bodhicitta. So it's just how it works. Without bodhicitta, we can't. We will never actually obtain that result.
Okay, and I have a follow-up question to my previous question. So when we think of self-liberation and ultimate liberation, I think what I'm understanding is that it's like a dissecting path. It's not congruent where I go through self-liberation. But I guess my question is, does every single being have to go through self-liberation before you actually get to ultimate enlightenment, or are there two dissecting paths?
So yeah, it's considered from the Mahayana perspective. I mean, of course, you'll get different answers depending on which kind of practitioner you ask, um, because generally speaking, the Theravadan tradition isn't going to, they're going to just encourage people to follow this path of individual liberation. And from the Mahayana perspective, it isn't achieving individual liberation first doesn't completely block the possibility of achieving full enlightenment, but they do say that it does make it more difficult. For one, you're spending eons and eons of time kind of experiencing that individual liberation. And then even if you happen to be, as I mentioned, like exhorted by a Buddha to, you have such deep familiarity, in your mind with that path, that it's a challenge, to overcome that. So from the Mahayana perspective, the best thing to do is to just go straight into the Mahayana, to not take a, they would really consider it a detour. They would consider it kind of an unnecessary detour. It can be completely bypassed, and that's the quickest route ultimately.
So even though it states that I have to achieve my own enlightenment before I can help enlighten anybody else, that is nothing to do with self-liberation. That's just
Right.
straight
You
enlightenment.
right. You as long as you yourself are not fully enlightened, as long as you yourself are not a Buddha, your ability to benefit others is limited. You gain, of course, more and more capacity over, as you progress toward enlightenment. You become more and more capable of being of benefit, but only a fully enlightened being is omniscient. Um, Up until that point, you are making mistakes. You're not fully capable. You might be of great benefit at various high levels. You might be of incredible benefit to others, but you're not of perfect benefit. You're not, and there's ways of, up until a certain point, there are ways of falling back down, right? You could, you might be making a lot of progress, and then, you stop making progress, you start going in the wrong direction. There's a certain point where that danger is avoided, is averted, but that's a very, very high level. So for a long time, there is a very real danger of falling completely off the path. But yeah, ultimately, we do want to go for full enlightenment, full Buddhahood, because that is a state that is eternal. You can't fall back down. There's no danger, and you have omniscience. You've cleared away even the subtle obscurations, and so so you're able to emanate back into cyclic existence forever to liberate sentient beings.
Thank you.
So we'll talk about now the first of these two methods, for actually this aspiration, this wish to achieve one's own enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings, is generated in one of two ways, or both. You could do both. They're not mutually exclusive. The first of these two ways of actually becoming a bodhisattva, actually being able to say, I genuinely, spontaneously, naturally desire to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings, is developed in these two ways. So the first is called the 6 causes and 1 effect meditation, or the 7-point cause and effect meditation. Okay, So there's, as I said, there are six steps, and they lead to a result. So this first step is to recognize all sentient beings as having been one's own mother. And this goes back to the first slide that we showed in today's class, where it said all mother migratory beings. What that refers to is this idea here, that given that we've had beginningless past lives, then that means just mathematically that every other sentient being has played the role of one's own mother. In Tibetan culture, the mother is kind of understood to be the caregiver. The fathers are kind of, culturally speaking, kind of not so in the picture with the child rearing and all that. So it's sort of a cultural teaching, but it means that, the caregiver. Um, and of course, there are unique kindnesses of the mother, right? The mother is the one who carries us in the womb. The mother is the one who feeds us from their own body. Um, and historically speaking, culturally speaking, they're often the one that gets the duties of looking after the infant and so on. So we really, so here with this, we're just looking at this as sort of a math problem, right? Just as a fact that sentient beings necessarily have played that role for us many times, because all consciousnesses are literally beginningless, literally eternal. Um, and so unavoidably, mathematically, it must be true. But we have to contemplate, we have to see the logic of that. And then once we see the logic of that, we go on to step two, which is to recognize the kindness of all of these mother sentient beings. So again, I mentioned some of those kindnesses. So we really think about the fact that, in the womb, I was protected. My mother was careful to avoid, dangerous activities, was trying to eat the right kinds of food, was trying to, take the right kinds of vitamins, and then underwent the pain of childbirth, and then I was helpless for years and years. I was completely dependent upon the kindness of others to maintain my life. I needed to be fed, I needed to be changed, I needed to be looked after. So we think about all of these kindnesses that were, teaching us how to dress ourselves, how to feed ourselves, um, how to speak, how to read, how to write, all of these incredible kindnesses that we benefited from, literally protecting our lives and making our lives, giving us the skills that we needed to be self-sufficient, and so on. So we think about all of these things that caregivers, mothers, etc., showed to us. And we generalize them, of course, not only to the mother that we had in this life, but we join it with the first step of understanding that every sentient being has played that kind of role. So every sentient being has been kind to us in those similar ways. And then step three is we generate the wish to repay their kindness. And they basically say that this should flow sort of naturally, right? We just by contemplating, they've done this and they've done this and they've done this. Of course, like, I want to help them now. They've helped me. They literally kept me alive. They sacrificed so much for my life, for my health, for my safety. I should, of course, it would only be right for me to repay their kindness. And then we generate step four is then to generate kind of a warm-hearted affection for all, toward all of these mother sentient beings, to see them in this warm, positive light, to regard them, affectionately, to have a sense of closeness, to have a sense of affectionate love toward all sentient beings. and then to generate great compassion. So here we recognize that these kind mother sentient beings, so compassion specifically, the word compassion in Tibetan has this connotation of wishing sentient beings to be free of suffering. So here we think about all of the sufferings that these kind mother sentient beings are subject to. The suffering of death, the suffering of aging, the suffering of being separated from what they enjoy, the suffering of meeting with what they don't enjoy, the suffering of the lower realms, the subtle sufferings of the upper realms. We recognize that all of these kind mother sentient beings are having all of these challenging, painful experiences again and again and again, lifetime after lifetime after lifetime, never really being truly happy, never really being contented, always experiencing challenges, painful inner and outer conditions, loneliness, depression, anxiety, grief, all of these things that characterize experience. And then we wish for them to be free of all of those sufferings, all of those painful conditions. So then, on the basis of that great love, that feeling of warm heartedness, closeness, wishing for their happiness, understanding that they're not happy, understanding that in fact they suffer, endlessly they suffer, we then think, okay, it isn't sufficient for me to just hope that someone comes along and does something. I have to actually take responsibility. I have to actually be the one. I want to be the one because they have been so kind to me, because they all they want is happiness. All they want is to be free of suffering. And yet they never are able to accomplish that as ordinary sentient beings. I myself will bear the responsibility of leading them to enlightenment, of actually creating the causes and conditions for them to obtain what they want, to have genuine, real, lasting happiness, contentment, bliss, and to be free of even the slightest suffering. That's the uncommon attitude of universal responsibility, not leaving any sentient being out. Okay, and then I don't have a slide here. I don't know what, there's no, this leads to bodhicitta, right? So on the basis of this taking responsibility, we then think, okay, I wish this for all sentient beings. They wish this for themselves, and I wish to bring this about for them. However, I understand that that is a crazy idea, right? It would be like looking at the world and recognizing all of the suffering that results from, you know, heart disease and thinking, I want to alleviate all forms of heart disease on the earth. Um, but then thinking, well, I don't even know what the chambers of the heart are. I don't even know. I just understand how terrible this suffering is. And I deeply wish sentient beings to be free of it. But I have, but I'm powerless. I have absolutely, other than this wish, other than this deep-seated desire, it's absurd that I think I could actually do anything to bring about that result. So bodhicitta is step 7, is the result of this taking responsibility for bringing about the result of all sentient beings being free of suffering, having genuine happiness, because we understand that it's only the state of full enlightenment that is that. Because even the state, we've said, I mean, a person could remain in the state of individual liberation, but it's also true that they're going to get kind of pestered by enlightened beings who are like going to encourage them to, to go even further. And there is nothing further, once you've removed the subtle obscurations to omniscience, that's it. You can't go any further, which is what happens with full enlightenment. So we would understand that the only pathway um, is full enlightenment. And therefore, I have to achieve that for myself first, and then I can use that. I gain full omniscience. And also, because without omniscience, I'm still limited. Without omniscience, which even if I were to achieve individual liberation, I myself would lack omniscience. Um, I don't know exactly how to help sentient beings. I don't know what is the perfect advice because I can't see their karma. I can't see all of the karmic causes and conditions that are ripening for them. So um, I I myself have to achieve enlightenment because there's no other way, there's no other result that allows me to really be of benefit to sentient beings. And then that is what ultimately generates the mind of bodhicitta in the mind of the practitioner, and then they become a bodhisattva. So that's the first meditative technique that can give rise, validly, it's a valid technique. It works, it generates, bodhicitta in the minds of practitioners who, follow through on it. Again, of course, with the caveat that we're assuming that this person has mastered the small scope and mastered the middle scope. And once you've done that, and then you're working with these meditations, you could use this technique and you will achieve bodhicitta. You will become a bodhisattva. There's also another method called equalizing and exchanging self for other. And they describe this as a more difficult technique. It may be more effective for some practitioners. Some practitioners might be more well suited to using this technique. And if, so it could be a faster route to bodhicitta for some practitioners. But practitioners can certainly work with both of these and, kind of go back and forth, use both of these to try to bring about this result of bodhicitta. So this technique, so the first technique, we saw how it's very kind of, it's kind of based on the idea of reciprocity, right? It's this idea, well, I've benefited from all sentient beings, and so therefore I want to benefit all sentient beings. So it's kind of self-centered in a way, right? The practitioner hasn't gone beyond this idea of repaying the kindness of others. It's kind of like I got a present from all other sentient beings, and now I want to give a present to all other sentient beings. What's different, I mean, what's unique about it is that it doesn't leave anyone out. It does generalize that idea of receiving something of incredible value to every single sentient being without any exceptions. And so that makes it effective rather than just thinking, well, I can only remember getting a gift from this person and this person and this person. I can't remember getting a gift from this person and that person. And so I can leave them out. So, it still works, but it hinges on reciprocity. And the second technique doesn't. The second technique, it's called equalizing and exchanging self for other. What it means is equalizing self-cherishing for cherishing others, and then exchanging other cherishing for self-cherishing. So first we get to the point where we have, so when we go back to equanimity, equanimity was dealing with the bias that we have uh, between friend, enemy, and stranger. Those are the words that they use in Buddhism, right? People that have benefited us, people who haven't benefited us or harmed us, and then those that have harmed us, friend, enemy, friend, stranger, and enemy, friend, enemy, stranger, whatever. But developing equanimity for friend, enemy, and stranger doesn't touch the self-cherishing mind, the mind that places oneself above even our friends, even our closest, our husband, our wife, our, maybe to some degree our child, who knows. We often will place ourselves above even our loved ones, because of the mind of self-cherishing. We can develop equal regard for friend, enemy, and stranger, and still put ourselves first, put ourselves above all of those people. With equalizing and exchanging self-cherishing for other cherishing, we deal with this mind of self-cherishing, self-grasping, by looking at the shortcomings of the mind that looks out only for oneself, the mind that is interested only in one's own welfare, by contemplating how self-centered that is, how that separates ourselves from others, how that gives rise to conflict, how that creates agitation when other people mistreat us, because we expect other people to always be kind to us. And there's all kinds of different ways of contemplating the disadvantages of the mind of self-cherishing and the advantages of the mind that cherishes others. But basically, we're just getting right to the heart of this issue by bypassing all of this contemplation of, well, people were kind, I should be kind back, and so on, by just thinking, up until now, I've really only cared about myself. And that's gotten me into all kinds of trouble. This mind of self-cherishing, this mind that only looks out for my own interests. If I can learn to cherish the needs of others, and even more than my own needs, then I can completely overcome those tendencies, those habits. And once I do that, simply by cherishing others, then we get that same result, right? Of recognizing, well, if I cherish others more than myself, and others deeply wish to be happy, deeply wish to be free of suffering, and others are not experiencing happiness, they are experiencing suffering, then still I end up in the same place. I end up wanting that for sentient beings, and I still generate bodhicitta. I still generate the mind of enlightenment, the mind that seeks my enlightenment for the benefit of others, now only because I'm cherishing them more than myself. So they do describe this because that reciprocal model is familiar to us, right? It's comfortable. It's kind of, society is based on reciprocity. Society is based on being kind to those who are kind to us. So that first technique is tapping into what's comfortable, what we're already familiar with. This is radical. This technique is much more difficult, but could be maybe faster, kind of getting at the heart of the problem in a deeper way. So they describe this as a technique that is not suitable for all people at all. Maybe at a certain point in a person's development, it becomes more suitable. And there could be some some bodhisattva, some aspiring bodhisattvas who, just based on their own proclivities, their own, what's difficult for them, maybe the first technique is a better vehicle for them. For other aspiring bodhisattvas, this technique, maybe, they could use it more effectively. But these are the two processes that both can be used to generate bodhicitta, the mind that aspires for one's enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. Okay, so this maybe would be better placed earlier in the presentation, because there was a slide that talked about the three types of morality. Um, even if I achieve bodhicitta, but I don't practice the three types of morality. So this is just to explain what that means, the three types of morality: the morality of purifying negativities, the morality of restraining the mind from increasing negativity or engaging in negativity, and then the mind that seeks to accumulate virtue, the three types of ethics, to the three types of morality: purification, restraining the mind from non-virtue, and then finding ways of engaging in virtue. So that's just a way of explaining what that meant in that slide, the three types of morality. Okay, so that's all I had for today. We have a couple of minutes left if there are any questions or objections, points of concern, disagreement. Yes.
None of the above. Just clarity for my own self. Because I think my assumption is maybe it's just my own thinking that aspiring bodhicitta was having that wish for wanting to benefit all sentient beings and to take them to enlightenment. And then engaging bodhicitta was me actively doing things like practicing generosity. You know what I mean? Like actively doing. And I think maybe I'm just getting caught up in what the words mean in English. Aspiring means having the thought, and then engaging means actually doing the actions.
Right. I mean, it does, but until you can't really do those actions without that aspiration
Mm-hmm.
being, as I mentioned, like spontaneous, uncontrived. You still have more to do, right? Because I mean, and again, in this class, like the bodhisattva grounds and paths, like I mean, they're touched on a little bit. We'll touch on them a little bit next week. But like the difference between a bodhisattva and a Buddha is huge, right? A bodhisattva may not have had a direct realization of emptiness, yet still has a tremendous amount of additional spiritual work to do. And they're doing that in the process of engaging bodhicitta, like engaging, they're practicing the six perfect, like you said, generosity, patience, ethics, all of the six perfections. That becomes like the focal point of how that bodhisattva is becoming a Buddha. That's the pathway into becoming. So for an ordinary practitioner, the first goal is to become a bodhisattva, but then the bodhisattva has to become a Buddha. And so they have a tremendous amount of work that they have to do. But really, we can't say that we're doing that work if bodhicitta is not yet our actual like baseline state. If it's not stable, if it's not uncontrived, if it's it has to really be there in the mind in a really deep way. Otherwise, like if it's just willy-nilly or if it's just really weak, then we can't really say that we're engaging in bodhicitta up until that point. We might be doing some like the Bodhisattva vows, we might be, using the Bodhisattva vows to kind of help us to get there and so on. Um, but yeah, it has to become a stable, deep realization in the mind, and then we really act on it, and then we really, start getting to work doing all of the six perfections and all of that to do the work of benefiting sentient beings.
So, so you're not, so even though so taking the Bodhisattva vows means you've entered the Bodhisattva path, but until you realized ultimate bodhicitta through direct realization of emptiness, you're not a bodhisattva.
No, you're not an Arya Bodhisattva.
Oh,
No, so those two things are different. Until you've had an uncontrived, meaning like effortless, spontaneous, real, so if for you, if you can say, because a bodhisattva is someone who understands that they themselves have to achieve enlightenment for the
yeah.
benefit of all sentient beings. So if they can say genuinely that every action of body, speech, and mind, every moment of every day, is actually aimed at enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings, then they have uncontrived, spontaneous, bodhicitta is so deeply ingrained in their mind that it becomes their baseline state. And then they are a bodhisattva. Um, they may not be an Arya Bodhisattva yet. They may not have had that. That may come later. Some practitioners will realize emptiness first and bodhicitta second. And for some practitioners, they'll realize bodhicitta first, and then emptiness, or I don't know if I reversed it, but it can happen in either order. Um, but for a Mahayana practitioner, you do have to have both. For a Theravadan practitioner, it's sufficient to just have a direct realization of emptiness without bodhicitta. But for a Mahayana practitioner, both have to be joined at some point. But one happens before the other.
So this is my last question. I've just been thinking a lot about this. So on this Arya Bodhisattva path, or just on the Bodhisattva path, do you actually have to be in a human realm to practice, or can you practice this in a pure land? Because you have to engage. I guess for the engagement part is what I'm trying to clarify in my own mind. Do we need human beings to engage, or do we need sentient beings to engage?
There's certainly, it's my understanding that there are some pure lands that are, not all pure lands are created equal in terms of their capacity to help a person to achieve enlightenment. But there are pure lands where, because ultimately the actual ultimate final doorway into enlightenment is the Vajrayana path. And there are pure lands where it's possible to practice Vajrayana. So yeah, I mean, you don't, and and of course there are stories of the Buddha in his previous lives as a bodhisattva, like practicing where he was able to engage in some practice of even in the hell realms and so on, having great love, having great compassion for the other sentient beings in the hell realms while he himself was in the hell realms, and in the animal realm and so on, engaging in these very high level bodhisattvas can engage in certain practices in other realms. The human realm is particularly well suited to Vajrayana practice. But I don't think it's the only place within, there are some pure lands where it's still possible to practice Vajrayana as well.
Thank you, Venerable.
All right. So we will.
Venerable.
Pardon?
Quick question.
Oh, yes. Mhm.
When you have the non-contrived bodhicitta, do you have this thought that I am happy to come back as many times as anywhere where beings need help? As
I
many
mean,
times.
I would assume that a person at that level, because their only goal at that point is full enlightenment. They don't have any, they don't have any goal other than full enlightenment. So I would think that they've worked on, kind of the the narrow self-interested mind to the point where like whatever is going to bring about full enlightenment. Of course, they would still. The reason that the Vajrayana path exists is because it's comparatively quick. Um, and so, of course, they would still aspire, they would be willing to do, but the reason that they would want to do something that was quick isn't to avoid their own suffering, but it's to shorten the amount of time that other sentient beings are waiting for their enlightenment. That would be the draw of a quick path of Vajrayana. So yeah, I would think that they would basically, their aspiration would be whatever is going to get me enlightened as quickly as possible. So they wouldn't necessarily want to lollygag, within cyclic existence. They would still want to take a direct route, but it wouldn't be out of self-interest.
Okay, so and coming back to help others is also automatic, basically, for them.
Well, that's the only advantage of enlightenment. That's the only selling point for a Buddha, is that it's great love and great compassion that motivates all of that emanation, all of that returning into cyclic existence. Is just the fact that sentient beings remain, and sentient beings are suffering, and the wish for them not to suffer. So that is the only motivating force of a Buddha, is wanting to eliminate the suffering of sentient beings.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So we finish up next week with class 5, where we'll talk about a little bit about the six perfections, a little bit about the Bodhisattva grounds, and then we'll spend most of the time talking about the direct realization of the nature of reality, what that kind of really means. We'll spend most of our time talking about that. All right, I hope to see everybody next week. Take care.